Sarah Martinez had always known that being a woman in the military came with extra challenges. At 28, she had worked twice as hard as her male colleagues to earn her position as a communications specialist in the elite Delta Force unit stationed at Fort Bragg. Her days started before dawn and ended well past midnight, but she never complained. This was her dream, and she was living it. The morning of March 15th began like any other. Sarah laced up her combat boots in the dimly lit barracks, her mind already focused on the day's training exercises. The unit was preparing for a classified mission overseas, and every detail mattered. She grabbed her gear and headed to the mess hall, where the familiar sounds of soldiers eating breakfast and discussing tactics filled the air. "Morning, Martinez," called out Sergeant Jake Thompson, a burly man with a permanent scowl who had made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in special operations. "Hope you're ready for today's exercise. It's going to separate the real soldiers from the pretenders." Sarah nodded politely, refusing to take the bait. She had learned long ago that responding to Thompson's provocations only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her breakfast and reviewed her mission notes. Today's exercise involved a simulated hostage rescue in an abandoned warehouse complex about 30 miles from base. Her role was crucial. She would be responsible for maintaining communication between the assault teams and command. The team loaded into armored vehicles just after sunrise. Sarah sat quietly in the back of the lead vehicle, checking and rechecking her equipment. Her radio systems were functioning perfectly, and she had backup units ready in case of technical failures. Around her, the other soldiers joked and trash-talked, the usual pre-mission banter that helped ease tension. Lieutenant Colonel James Burke, the unit commander, briefed them one final time as they approached the exercise area. Burke was a fair leader who had always treated Sarah with respect, but she knew that not everyone in the chain of command shared his progressive views. The mission was straightforward: enter the warehouse, neutralize the mock terrorists, and extract the hostages without casualties. The warehouse complex was a maze of concrete buildings and narrow alleyways, perfect for urban warfare training. Sarah positioned herself in the command vehicle, establishing communication links with each assault team. Her voice was calm and professional as she coordinated the complex operation, relaying information about enemy positions and updating teams on each other's movements. Everything was going according to plan until Alpha Team encountered unexpected resistance in Building 3. The mock terrorists had set up an ambush that caught the team off guard. Sarah quickly redirected Bravo Team to provide support while maintaining contact with the hostage rescue unit moving through Building 1. "All teams, this is communications. Alpha needs immediate backup in Building 3 south entrance. Bravo Team, adjust your approach vector to provide covering fire." Sarah spoke into her headset, her fingers flying over the radio controls. The exercise was intense, but Sarah thrived under pressure. She had trained for scenarios like this, and her performance was flawless. The team successfully completed their objectives, extracting all hostages and neutralizing the threats. As they regrouped in the parking area, there was a sense of satisfaction among the soldiers. That's when things took a dark turn. Sergeant Thompson approached Sarah as she was packing up her communication equipment. His face was flushed with anger, and several other soldiers had gathered around, creating a circle that blocked her from view of the command vehicle. "You screwed up in there, Martinez," Thompson snarled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your communication delays nearly got Alpha Team killed." Sarah looked up, confused. "Sergeant, my communications were clear and timely. All teams acknowledged receipt of updates within standard parameters. Don't lie to me." Thompson stepped closer, his bulk intimidating. "I heard the delays. You're not cut out for this kind of work. Maybe you should transfer to a desk job where you can't get real soldiers hurt." The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement with Thompson while others looked uncertain. Sarah realized that this confrontation had been planned. Thompson had been looking for an excuse to challenge her competence, and he was using the successful exercise as cover for his attack. "I stand by my performance today," Sarah said firmly, continuing to pack her equipment. "The mission was completed successfully with 0 casualties." "That was luck, not skill," Thompson shot back. "You're a liability to this unit. Women don't belong in special ops, and you're proof of that." The tension in the group was rising. Sarah could feel the hostility radiating from several of the soldiers, but she also noticed that some of them looked uncomfortable with Thompson's aggressive behavior. She knew that responding emotionally would only validate their prejudices, so she maintained her professional composure. Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of the younger officers, stepped forward. "Sergeant Thompson, maybe we should discuss this back at base with the colonel." Thompson whirled around to face Rodriguez. "Stay out of this, Lieutenant. This is between me and the communications operator who nearly compromised the mission." The confrontation was escalating beyond a simple disagreement about performance. Sarah recognized the signs of a coordinated attack on her position in the unit. She had faced discrimination before, but never this openly or aggressively. She realized that Thompson and his supporters had been waiting for an opportunity like this. "I'm going to report this to Colonel Burke," Sarah said, shouldering her pack and preparing to leave. That's when Thompson made his move. He grabbed her arm roughly, spinning her around to face him. "You're not going anywhere until we settle this." Sarah tried to pull away, but Thompson's grip was strong. The other soldiers formed a tighter circle, effectively trapping her. She could see that some of them were recording the confrontation with their phones, though she couldn't tell if they were documenting Thompson's misconduct or planning to use the footage against her. "Let go of me, Sergeant," Sarah said loudly, hoping that someone in authority would hear and intervene. Instead of releasing her, Thompson pushed her backward. Sarah stumbled, but managed to keep her footing. The circle of soldiers tightened further, and she realized that this situation was about to turn violent. She had trained in hand-to-hand combat, but she was outnumbered and surrounded by men who were larger and stronger than her. The warehouse complex suddenly felt very isolated. The command vehicle was parked several hundred yards away, and the exercise area was surrounded by empty fields. Sarah understood that whatever happened next would determine not just her future in the military, but possibly her safety and well-being. Thompson's face was twisted with rage and something else, a satisfaction that suggested he had been planning this moment for a long time. The other soldiers watched with varying expressions of anticipation, discomfort, and curiosity. Sarah realized that she was completely alone, facing a situation that had moved far beyond professional disagreement into something much more dangerous. The silence stretched between Sarah and the circle of soldiers for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. She could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of vehicles from the main road. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete, making the abandoned warehouse complex feel even more isolated and threatening. Thompson's grip on her arm tightened, and Sarah knew she had to act quickly. Her military training kicked in and she assessed her options. Fighting back against multiple opponents wasn't ideal, but allowing herself to become a victim wasn't an option either. She had worked too hard to get where she was to let fear control her actions now. "Sergeant Thompson, you need to release me immediately," Sarah said in her clearest command voice. "This behavior is completely unacceptable and will be reported to the proper authorities." Some of the soldiers in the circle shifted uncomfortably at her words. Private Collins, a young man who had always been polite to Sarah, looked particularly uneasy. She could see doubt creeping into his expression, as if he was beginning to question whether he wanted to be part of whatever Thompson had planned. But Thompson wasn't backing down. If anything, her professional response seemed to anger him more. "You think you can threaten me? You think your little reports and complaints mean anything? Women like you come and go in this unit, but soldiers like me are here for the long haul." Sarah realized that Thompson's hostility went deeper than simple prejudice. He saw her success as a personal threat to his authority and status within the unit. She had earned commendations for her performance, received praise from superior officers, and proven herself capable of handling high-pressure situations. To someone like Thompson, who relied on intimidation and traditional hierarchies to maintain his position, her competence was threatening. "This isn't about my performance," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This is about your insecurity and inability to accept that women can be just as capable as men in combat situations." The words hit their mark. Thompson's face darkened further, and several of the other soldiers muttered among themselves. Sarah had called out the real issue, and everyone present knew it. Thompson had been looking for an excuse to assert his dominance. and the successful completion of the exercise had denied him that opportunity. "You think you're so smart?" Thompson said through gritted teeth. "Let's see how smart you are when things get real." Before Sarah could react, Thompson shoved her hard in the chest. She stumbled backward, her heavy pack throwing off her balance. As she tried to regain her footing, her heel caught on a piece of broken concrete and she fell heavily to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but Sarah's training took over. She rolled to the side and started to get back to her feet, knowing that staying down made her more vulnerable. But Thompson was already moving toward her, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "Stay down," he commanded. "This is what happens when you don't know your place." Sarah ignored his words and continued to rise. She had faced bullies before, both in the military and in civilian life, and she knew that showing weakness would only encourage more aggression. As she stood up, she noticed that the circle of soldiers had grown smaller, with some of them backing away from the confrontation. Private Jenkins, an older soldier who had served multiple deployments, stepped forward. "Sergeant, maybe this has gone far enough." "The lieutenant's right. We should handle this back at base." Thompson spun around to face Jenkins, his anger now directed at anyone who questioned his authority. "Are you questioning my judgment, Private? Because if you are, maybe you need to learn the same lesson." The threat was clear, and Jenkins stepped back. Sarah realized that Thompson's behavior wasn't just directed at her. He was using intimidation to control all the soldiers under his command. She wondered how many others had faced similar treatment but had been too afraid to speak up. "This ends now," Sarah said firmly, reaching for her radio to call for backup. But Thompson was faster. He lunged forward and grabbed the radio from her hand, throwing it hard against the concrete wall where it shattered into pieces. The destruction of her communication equipment was not just practical, it was symbolic. Thompson was cutting her off from help and asserting his complete control over the situation. "No one's calling for help," Thompson said, his voice now dangerously calm. "We're going to settle this here and now, the way soldiers have always settled disputes." Sarah understood that she was facing more than workplace harassment. Thompson's actions had crossed the line into assault, and she was completely isolated from any support or intervention. The other soldiers seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of the way. She made a quick decision. Rather than wait for Thompson's next move, she would take the initiative. Her hand-to-hand combat training had taught her that surprise was often more valuable than strength, especially when facing a larger opponent. Sarah feinted to the left, then quickly moved right, trying to break through the circle of soldiers and reach the open area where she might have room to maneuver. But Thompson anticipated her move and blocked her path, his large frame easily stopping her escape attempt. "Going somewhere?" he taunted. "The lesson isn't over yet." That's when he kicked her. The blow caught Sarah in the side of the head just above her left ear. The impact was immediate and devastating, sending her sprawling to the ground with her vision blurred and her ears ringing. The taste of blood filled her mouth and she could feel warmth spreading down the side of her face. The kick had been deliberate and vicious, delivered with the full force of Thompson's military training. It wasn't a push or a shove. It was a calculated assault designed to cause serious injury. The other soldiers stood in shocked silence, clearly not expecting the confrontation to escalate to actual violence. Sarah lay on the concrete, struggling to maintain consciousness. Her head throbbed with intense pain, and she could feel her awareness slipping in and out of focus. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear voices, but they seemed distant and unclear. Thompson stood over her, breathing hard from adrenaline and anger. "Maybe now you'll understand your place in this unit," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. But even as Sarah fought to stay conscious, she could hear something else, a sound that made Thompson's expression change from satisfaction to concern. In the distance, growing louder by the second, was the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching the exercise area. The timing was coincidental but perfect. An unscheduled inspection was about to arrive, and Thompson realized that his carefully planned lesson in dominance was about to become a career-ending mistake. The helicopter sound grew louder, and Sarah, despite her injuries, managed a small smile. Help was coming, even if she hadn't been able to call for it herself. The sound of the approaching helicopter sent panic through the group of soldiers. Thompson's confident demeanor cracked as he realized the implications of what had just happened. A soldier lying injured on the ground after what was supposed to be a routine training exercise, would demand immediate investigation and explanation. "Get her up," Thompson hissed to the other soldiers, his voice tight with fear. "Help her stand. Make it look like an accident during the exercise." But Sarah was barely conscious. The kick to her head had caused a concussion, and she was struggling to focus her vision or coordinate her movements. Blood trickled from a cut above her ear where Thompson's boot had connected, and her face was already beginning to swell. Private Collins knelt beside Sarah, his young face pale with worry. "Sergeant, she's really hurt. Look at her eyes. They're not focusing properly. This isn't something we can just cover up." The helicopter was getting closer, and through her blurred vision, Sarah could make out its shape against the afternoon sky. It wasn't the standard transport helicopter used for routine operations. This was a command aircraft, the type used by high-ranking officers for official inspections and investigations. Lieutenant Rodriguez had moved away from the group and was frantically trying to reach someone on his radio. "Base, this is Rodriguez. We have a medical situation at the exercise area. Requesting immediate medical support." Thompson grabbed Rodriguez's radio before he could say anything more. "Negative on that request," Thompson said into the device, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Everything is under control here. No medical assistance required," but it was too late. The helicopter was already circling the exercise area, and whoever was aboard would have a clear view of the scene below. Sarah lying injured on the concrete, surrounded by soldiers who looked guilty and frightened, was not something that could be easily explained away. As Sarah fought to remain conscious, she could hear the helicopter touching down about 50 yards away. The rotor wash kicked up dust and debris, forcing the soldiers to shield their eyes and step back. Through the swirling dust, she could make out figures emerging from the aircraft. Even in her injured state, Sarah recognized the significance of what she was seeing. 3 men in crisp uniforms stepped out of the helicopter, their bearing and decorations marking them as high-ranking officers. These weren't local commanders or routine inspectors. These were generals, the kind of senior leadership that only appeared when something serious was happening. Thompson's face went white as he recognized the ranks of the approaching officers. Whatever he had expected to deal with, it wasn't a surprise visit from 3-star generals. The timing couldn't have been worse for him, and he knew it. The lead officer was General Patricia Hayes, a stern woman in her 50s who had earned her rank through decades of exemplary service and a reputation for refusing to tolerate any form of misconduct. Behind her walked General Robert Chen, the head of special operations for the entire Eastern Command, and General Michael Torres, whose specialty was military justice and personnel investigations. Sarah tried to sit up as the generals approached, but her head spun violently and she had to lie back down. The concrete felt cold against her cheek, and she could taste more blood in her mouth. Despite her condition, she felt a surge of hope. These weren't just any officers. They were exactly the kind of people who would take her situation seriously. General Hayes reached the group first, her sharp eyes taking in the scene instantly. Her gaze moved from Sarah lying injured on the ground to Thompson's panicked expression, to the circle of soldiers who looked like they wanted to disappear. "What exactly is happening here?" General Hayes asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate and honest answers. Thompson stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. "Ma'am, we've just completed a successful training exercise. Specialist Martinez appears to have suffered a minor injury during the operation. We were about to transport her back to base for medical evaluation." General Hayes knelt beside Sarah, her expression softening slightly as she assessed the injury. "Specialist, can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah tried to focus on the general's face, but her vision kept blurring. She knew this was her moment to speak up, to tell the truth about what Thompson had done, but forming words was difficult and she wasn't sure how clearly she could communicate. "He kicked me," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, "in the head. It wasn't an accident." The words hung in the air like an explosive charge. General Hayes's expression hardened as she looked back at Thompson, whose face had gone from white to gray. The other generals moved closer, their attention now focused entirely on the injured soldier and the implications of her statement. General Chen stepped forward, his voice cold and professional. "Sergeant Thompson, I need you to explain exactly what happened here, and I need the truth." Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Sir, There may have been some confusion during the post-exercise discussion. Things got heated, but there was no intentional assault. Any injury was accidental. But General Torres was already examining the scene with the eye of an experienced investigator. He noted the broken radio equipment, the positioning of the soldiers, and the nature of Sarah's injuries. Everything pointed to a deliberate assault, not an accident during training. Private Collins, General Torres called out, having identified the youngest soldier as most likely to tell the truth. I want you to tell me exactly what you witnessed here. Take your time and be completely honest. Collins looked terrified, caught between his fear of Thompson and his respect for the general's authority. His eyes darted between Thompson's threatening glare and Sarah's injured form on the ground. Sir, Sergeant Thompson was angry about Specialist Martinez's performance during the exercise. Collins began, his voice shaking. He said she didn't belong in the unit because she's a woman. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her and pushed her down. Then he kicked her in the head while she was on the ground. The confession sent shockwaves through the group. Several soldiers stepped back from Thompson as if his misconduct might be contagious. The general's expressions grew progressively darker as they absorbed the full implications of what had occurred. General Hayes immediately called for medical assistance while General Chen began separating the soldiers for individual questioning. General Torres focused his attention on Thompson, whose career had just ended in the most spectacular and public way possible. Sergeant Thompson, you are under arrest for assault on a fellow service member, General Torres announced, his voice carrying across the exercise area. You will be immediately relieved of all duties pending a full investigation and court-martial. Military police, who had apparently been traveling with the generals, quickly took Thompson into custody. His protests and attempts to justify his actions fell on deaf ears. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were talking, and his victim was lying injured before them. As medical personnel arrived and began treating Sarah's injuries, she felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The system had worked, even if it had taken a near disaster to bring justice. The general's unexpected arrival had prevented Thompson from covering up his assault and had ensured that the truth would come to light. But even as Sarah was being prepared for transport to the base hospital, she wondered about the larger implications of what had happened. Thompson's behavior hadn't developed overnight, and his willingness to assault a fellow soldier suggested a pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to fester unchecked. The base hospital was a flurry of activity as Sarah was rushed into the emergency room. The medical team worked quickly to assess her injuries, running tests to determine the extent of the damage from Thompson's vicious kick. Dr. Angela Morrison, the head of neurology, personally oversaw Sarah's care, her experienced hands checking for signs of serious brain injury. You have a moderate concussion, Dr. Morrison explained as Sarah's vision began to clear. There's some swelling, but the CT scan shows no signs of permanent damage. You're going to have headaches and dizziness for a while, but you should make a full recovery. Sarah felt relief wash over her, though the physical pain was still intense. Her head throbbed with every heartbeat and bright lights made her nauseous. But knowing that she would recover fully was a huge weight off her shoulders. She had been afraid that Thompson's attack might have caused permanent damage that could end her military career. While Sarah received medical treatment, the three generals were conducting a thorough investigation of the incident. They had separated all the soldiers who witnessed the assault and were interviewing them individually. The story that emerged was disturbing and painted a picture of systematic harassment and intimidation within the unit. General Hayes sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, her notepad ready as she prepared to take an official statement. Specialist Martinez, I need you to tell me everything that happened today, starting from the beginning of the exercise. Take your time and include every detail you can remember. Sarah recounted the events slowly, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She described Thompson's hostile behavior during breakfast, his escalating aggression after the successful exercise, and the way he had trapped her among the other soldiers. When she reached the part about the kick to her head, General Hayes's expression grew even more serious. Has Sergeant Thompson displayed this kind of behavior toward you before? General Hayes asked. Sarah nodded carefully, mindful of her headache. He's been hostile since I joined the unit 6 months ago. He's made comments about women not belonging in special operations, questioned my abilities in front of other soldiers, and generally tried to undermine my confidence. But he had never been physically violent before today. General Hayes made detailed notes as Sarah spoke. Have you reported any of this previous behavior to your commanding officers? I mentioned some of the verbal harassment to Lieutenant Colonel Burke, but I was told that dealing with difficult personalities was part of being in an elite unit. I was advised to focus on my performance and prove myself through my work, rather than filing formal complaints. The general's jaw tightened at this revelation. It suggested that the command structure had been aware of problems, but had chosen to ignore them rather than address the underlying issues. This kind of institutional failure to protect personnel was exactly what the military had been working to eliminate. Meanwhile, General Chen was conducting interviews with the other soldiers who had witnessed the assault. The picture that emerged was even more troubling than the immediate incident. Several soldiers admitted that Thompson had been running what amounted to a harassment campaign against Sarah for months. Private Jenkins, the older soldier who had tried to intervene during the confrontation, provided particularly damning testimony. Sergeant Thompson has been saying for months that he was going to find a way to get Martinez transferred out of the unit. He's been looking for any excuse to challenge her competence or question her fitness for duty. Other soldiers revealed that Thompson had been pressuring them to report false complaints about Sarah's performance, to exclude her from informal social activities, and to generally make her feel unwelcome in the unit. The systematic nature of the harassment painted Thompson not just as a violent individual, but as someone who had been deliberately trying to force a qualified soldier out of her position. General Torres was focusing his investigation on the command structure that had allowed this situation to develop. He interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Burke, who had been completely unaware of the assault until the generals arrived. Burke's shock at the revelation suggested either gross negligence in supervising his personnel or a deliberate decision to ignore warning signs. Colonel, how many complaints or concerns have been raised about Sergeant Thompson's behavior toward female personnel? General Torres asked. Burke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There have been a few informal mentions of personality conflicts, but nothing that rose to the level of formal complaints. Thompson is an experienced non-commissioned officer with an exemplary service record. Did you ever consider that the lack of formal complaints might be because personnel were afraid to come forward, rather than because no problems existed? General Torres pressed. The question hung in the air as Burke realized the implications of his oversight. His failure to investigate informal complaints and create an environment where personnel felt safe reporting harassment had contributed directly to the escalation that led to Sarah's assault. Back in the hospital, Sarah was beginning to understand the broader impact of what had happened. Word of the incident was spreading throughout the base, and she could see the shock and concern on the faces of the medical staff and visiting officers. This wasn't just about her individual situation anymore. It had become a test case for how the military handled harassment and assault within its ranks. General Hayes returned to Sarah's bedside with updates on the investigation. Specialist, I want you to know that we're taking this situation very seriously. Sergeant Thompson has been formally charged with assault and will face a court-martial. Additionally, we're conducting a comprehensive review of the entire command structure of your unit. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. She was glad that Thompson would face justice for his actions, but she was also aware that her career in this unit was effectively over. Whether she was vindicated or not, the dynamics within the team had been permanently altered. What happens to me now? Sarah asked. Will I be able to continue serving in special operations? General Hayes smiled for the first time since arriving at the base. Specialist, based on everything we've learned today, you've shown exactly the kind of courage and professionalism we want in our elite units. Once you've recovered from your injuries, you'll have several options. You can transfer to a different special operations unit. You can remain here under new leadership, or you can apply for advanced training programs. The general paused, then continued. What you won't have to do is tolerate harassment or prove yourself to people who are never going to accept you anyway. The military is changing, and incidents like this are helping us identify and eliminate the toxic elements that have no place in our modern force. Sarah felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. For months, she had been questioning whether she was strong enough or good enough to succeed in special operations. Thompson's constant harassment had made her doubt her abilities and wonder if she really belonged in the unit. Now she understood that the problem had never been her performance or her qualifications, It had been an individual who refused to accept change and progress. As evening fell, Sarah received visits from several of her fellow soldiers. Private Collins came by to apologize for not intervening sooner, and even Lieutenant Rodriguez stopped by to express his support. The solidarity she felt from her colleagues helped reinforce that Thompson's views were not representative of the entire unit. But the most significant visit came from Lieutenant Colonel Burke, who arrived with a formal apology and news that would reshape the entire unit. The investigation had revealed such extensive problems with leadership and culture that the Pentagon had decided to completely restructure the command. Burke was being reassigned, Thompson was facing criminal charges, and several other non-commissioned officers were being transferred or disciplined. Specialist Martinez, Burke said formally, I owe you an apology for failing to protect you from harassment and creating an environment where this assault could occur. The military justice system will hold everyone accountable for their actions, including my own failures as a commander. Sarah accepted his apology, though she knew that words couldn't undo the months of harassment she had endured. What mattered now was ensuring that future personnel wouldn't face the same challenges she had overcome. 3 weeks after the assault, Sarah was cleared to return to limited duty. Her headaches had mostly subsided, and the physical injuries had healed, but the psychological impact of the incident was still affecting her daily life. She found herself more alert to potential threats, more cautious around male colleagues, and more aware of the dynamics of power and intimidation within military hierarchies. The base had transformed dramatically during her recovery. News of the incident had reached the highest levels of the Pentagon, and Sarah's case had become a catalyst for sweeping changes in how the military addressed harassment and assault. Secretary of Defense Margaret Williams had personally reviewed the case and used it as justification for implementing new policies across all branches of the armed forces. Sarah's first day back was marked by a series of meetings with new leadership. Colonel Patricia Stone had been brought in to replace Burke, and her reputation for zero tolerance of misconduct preceded her. Stone was a decorated combat veteran who had successfully integrated several previously all-male units, and was known for her ability to change toxic cultures quickly and effectively. Specialist Martinez, Colonel Stone said during their first meeting, I want you to know that your courage in speaking up about the harassment and assault has already prevented similar incidents from happening to other service members. The changes we're implementing here will serve as a model for units throughout the military. The new policies were comprehensive and addressed many of the systemic issues that had allowed Thompson's behavior to continue unchecked. There were new reporting procedures that bypassed potentially hostile immediate supervisors, regular climate surveys to identify problems before they escalated, and mandatory training for all personnel on respectful workplace behavior and bystander intervention. Most importantly, there was a new culture of accountability that started at the top and flowed down through every level of command. Officers and non-commissioned officers were now evaluated not just on mission success, but on their ability to create inclusive and respectful environments for all personnel. The court-martial proceedings against Thompson began during Sarah's second week back on duty. As the key witness, she was required to testify about the assault and the pattern of harassment that preceded it. The military prosecutor, Major Lisa Chen, had built a comprehensive case that went far beyond the single incident of violence. The evidence will show, Major Chen told the court during opening arguments, that Sergeant Thompson conducted a systematic campaign of harassment designed to force a qualified service member out of her position based solely on her gender. The assault was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of months of deliberate misconduct. The trial attracted significant media attention, both from military publications and civilian news outlets. Sarah's case had become symbolic of broader issues within the armed forces, and advocacy groups were watching closely to see how the military justice system would handle such a high-profile case. During her testimony, Sarah spoke clearly and confidently about both the harassment and the assault. She had prepared extensively with the prosecutor, and her detailed recollection of events left little room for Thompson's defense team to create doubt about what had happened. Sergeant Thompson made it clear from my first day in the unit that he believed women had no place in special operations, Sarah testified. He consistently questioned my abilities, excluded me from informal activities, and made comments designed to undermine my confidence and effectiveness as a soldier. Thompson's defense attorney tried to portray the assault as a momentary loss of control rather than a calculated attack, but the testimony from other witnesses undermined this strategy. Private Collins and several other soldiers testified about Thompson's long-term pattern of hostility and his explicit statements about forcing Sarah out of the unit. The most damaging testimony came from former members of Thompson's previous units, who were brought in to establish a pattern of behavior. 3 different women testified about similar harassment they had experienced under Thompson's supervision, painting a picture of someone who had been allowed to drive qualified personnel away from their positions for years. As the trial progressed, Sarah began to understand the broader impact of her decision to speak up. Her case was being used not just to prosecute Thompson, but to examine and reform systemic problems throughout the military. Congressional hearings were scheduled to review military justice procedures, and her story was being cited in policy discussions at the highest levels of government. The support she received from unexpected quarters was overwhelming. Veterans organizations that had historically been resistant to change were now advocating for stronger protections against harassment. Military families were expressing support for her courage, and current service members were reaching out to share their own experiences with toxic leadership. General Hayes visited Sarah during the trial to provide updates on the broader investigation. "Specialist, what you experienced was unacceptable, but your response to it has been exemplary. You've shown that the system can work when people have the courage to speak up, and when leadership takes action to address problems." The general continued, "We've identified similar issues in 17 other units across the country. Your case has given us the tools and the mandate to address these problems before they escalate to violence. You've literally saved other service members from experiencing what you went through." This knowledge helped Sarah process the trauma of her experience. While she wouldn't have chosen to go through the harassment and assault, she could see that her survival and response had meaning beyond her individual situation. She was contributing to positive change that would benefit countless other service members. The trial also revealed the extent to which Thompson's behavior had been enabled by systemic failures. Multiple officers testified that they had received informal complaints about Thompson, but had failed to take action. The culture of the unit had normalized hostility toward women to such a no extent that serious harassment was dismissed as normal interpersonal conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Burke's testimony was particularly revealing. Under cross-examination, he admitted that he had received at least 6 informal complaints about Thompson's behavior toward female personnel over the past 2 years. Each time he had chosen to handle the situation through informal counseling rather than formal investigation. "I believe that Sergeant Thompson was a valuable asset to the unit," Burke testified, his voice barely audible. "I thought I could manage his personality issues without resorting to formal disciplinary action. I was wrong, and my failure to act decisively created the conditions that led to Specialist Martinez's assault." The prosecutor pressed Burke on his decision-making process. "Colonel, did it occur to you that your failure to take formal action might be sending a message that harassment of female personnel was acceptable?" Burke's silence spoke volumes. The courtroom was quiet as the implications of leadership failure became clear to everyone present. This wasn't just about one bad soldier. It was about a system that had consistently chosen to protect problematic personnel rather than their victims. As the trial neared its conclusion, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from being an isolated soldier struggling against harassment to being a symbol of courage and reform. The transformation was overwhelming, but she was determined to use her platform responsibly. The military prosecutor's closing argument was powerful and comprehensive. "Members of the court, this case is about more than one assault by one soldier. It's about our commitment to creating a military where all personnel can serve with dignity and respect. Sergeant Thompson's actions were not just an attack on Specialist Martinez. They were an attack on the values and principles that define our armed forces." Major Chen continued, "The evidence has shown that Sergeant Thompson conducted a deliberate campaign of harassment designed to force a qualified service member from her position. When that campaign failed, he escalated to physical violence. This behavior cannot be tolerated, and it must be punished to the fullest extent of military law." Thompson's defense made a final attempt to portray him as a dedicated soldier who had made a terrible mistake under pressure. But the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming, and the pattern of behavior was too clear to dismiss as an isolated incident. The court deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Thompson was found guilty of assault, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and violation of the military's anti-harassment policies. He was sentenced to reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 18 months, and dismissal from the service with a dishonorable discharge. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as the sentence was read. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness that it had taken such extreme circumstances to address problems that had been festering for years. She wondered how many other qualified personnel had been driven away by similar harassment before she had the opportunity to speak up. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive, and Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she hadn't sought. News organizations wanted interviews, advocacy groups wanted her to speak at conferences, and politicians wanted to cite her case in policy debates. She was careful to focus her public statements on the broader issues of military culture and reform, rather than seeking personal recognition. "My experience was unacceptable," Sarah told a reporter from Military Times. "But I want people to understand that the system worked once leadership was forced to confront the problem. The changes being implemented will prevent other service members from going through what I experienced." Colonel Stone approached Sarah the day after the verdict with an unexpected proposal. "Specialist, your demonstration of courage and professionalism throughout this ordeal has been exemplary. I'd like to recommend you for advanced leadership training and consideration for promotion to sergeant ahead of schedule." The offer was tempting, but Sarah had been thinking carefully about her future in the military. The assault and its aftermath had given her a different perspective on her career goals and the kind of impact she wanted to have. 6 months after the assault, Sarah stood in front of a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, preparing to address a gathering of military leaders from all branches of the armed forces. Her transformation from an isolated soldier fighting harassment to a recognized advocate for military reform had been rapid and profound. The young woman who had once questioned whether she belonged in special operations now commanded the attention of generals and admirals. The speech she was about to give would become part of mandatory training for all senior military leaders. Her story had been incorporated into leadership curricula, ethics courses, and command training programs across the entire Department of Defense. What had begun as a personal struggle against harassment had evolved into a catalyst for institutional change. 6 months ago, I was kicked in the head by a fellow soldier who believed that women had no place in elite military units. Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "Today I stand before you not as a victim, but as evidence that our military can and must do better in protecting all personnel from harassment and assault." The audience listened intently as Sarah described not just the incident itself, but the systemic failures that had allowed it to occur. She spoke about the importance of bystander intervention, the need for clear reporting procedures, and the responsibility of leadership to create inclusive environments where all personnel could succeed. "The assault I experienced was not inevitable," Sarah continued. "It was the predictable result of months of harassment that was ignored, minimized, and allowed to escalate. Every leader in this room has the power to prevent similar incidents by taking action when problems first emerge." Her presentation included concrete recommendations based on her experience and the subsequent investigation. She advocated for regular climate surveys, anonymous reporting systems, and accountability measures that held leaders responsible for the culture of their units. Most importantly, she emphasized the need to support personnel who reported harassment rather than viewing them as troublemakers. After her formal presentation, Sarah participated in small group discussions with senior officers. These conversations were often more impactful than her prepared remarks, as they allowed for detailed exploration of specific challenges and solutions. General Martinez, the Army Chief of Staff, approached Sarah during a break between sessions. "Specialist Martinez, your courage in speaking up has literally changed how we approach these issues. The policies we've implemented as a result of your case are already showing measurable improvements in unit climate surveys across the force. The statistics were encouraging. Reports of harassment had initially increased as new reporting procedures encouraged personnel to come forward, but the numbers were beginning to decline as toxic leaders were identified and removed. More importantly, surveys showed that personnel now felt more confident that reports would be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. Sarah's own career had taken an unexpected trajectory. Rather than pursuing traditional military advancement, she had been selected for a special assignment with the Pentagon's Equal Opportunity and Harassment Prevention Office. Her role involved traveling to different bases to assess unit climates, investigate complex cases, and train leaders on creating inclusive environments. The work was challenging but rewarding. Sarah found that her experience gave her unique credibility when speaking with both victims and leaders. She could relate to the fear and isolation that harassment victims experienced, while also understanding the institutional pressures that sometimes led leaders to avoid addressing difficult situations. One of her most significant cases involved a Navy base where 3 separate incidents of sexual assault had occurred within a 6-month period. The base commander had handled each case individually without recognizing the pattern that suggested broader cultural problems. Sarah's investigation revealed a toxic environment where predatory behavior was being enabled by leadership failure and peer pressure. "Commander, the problem isn't just these individual incidents," Sarah explained during her briefing. "The problem is a culture that allows predators to operate with impunity. Your personnel are afraid to report problems because they don't trust that action will be taken." Working with Navy leadership, Sarah helped implement comprehensive reforms that addressed both immediate safety concerns and long-term cultural issues. The base implemented new training programs, revised their reporting procedures, and most importantly, demonstrated through actions that harassment and assault would not be tolerated. The success of these interventions led to Sarah receiving recognition from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. She was awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for her contributions to improving military culture, and her work was cited in congressional testimony about military justice reform. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from fellow service members who reached out to share their own stories. Sarah received hundreds of emails and letters from personnel who had experienced harassment but had felt powerless to address it. Many credited her example with giving them the courage to speak up about their own situations. One letter particularly touched her heart. It came from Private Maria Santos, a young soldier stationed in Germany who had been experiencing harassment from her squad leader. After learning about Sarah's case, Santos had reported the harassment through proper channels, and the situation had been addressed before it could escalate to violence. "Ms. Martinez," Santos wrote, "your story gave me the courage to speak up about what was happening to me. Because of your example, I knew that the system could work if I was willing to trust it. The harassment stopped, my squad leader was reassigned, and I'm now thriving in my unit. Thank you for showing me that I didn't have to suffer in silence." Stories like Santos's reinforced for Sarah that her difficult experience had meaningful purpose. She was preventing other service members from enduring what she had gone through, and she was helping to create a military culture where personnel could focus on their missions rather than defending themselves from colleagues. As Sarah's assignment with the Pentagon drew to a close, she faced a significant decision about her future. She had been offered several options. She could return to special operations with a guarantee of placement in a reformed unit. She could pursue advanced education and training for a career in military justice, or she could transition to civilian service with organizations focused on workplace harassment prevention. The choice reflected how much her perspective had evolved since the assault. What had once seemed like a career-ending traumatic event had actually opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined. She had discovered a talent for leadership, advocacy, and institutional reform that went far beyond her original goals of succeeding in special operations. Colonel Stone, who had become a mentor and advocate, visited Sarah to discuss her options. "Specialist, you've proven yourself as both a soldier and a leader. Whatever path you choose, you'll have the full support of the military leadership. Your contributions have already made the entire force stronger and more effective." Sarah appreciated the support, but she knew that her decision had to be based on where she could have the greatest impact. The military had given her opportunities and training that had shaped her into the person she had become. Now she had to decide how to use those skills and experiences to continue making a positive difference. The irony wasn't lost on her that Thompson's assault, intended to drive her out of the military, had instead launched her into a position of influence and respect that she never could have achieved through traditional channels. His attempt to destroy her career had instead made her one of the most recognized advocates for positive change in military culture. 2 years after the assault that changed her life, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., announcing the launch of the Military Culture Reform Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to eliminate harassment and create inclusive environments across all branches of the armed forces. The initiative represented the culmination of everything she had learned and accomplished since that terrible day at the training exercise. Sarah had ultimately chosen to remain in military service, but in a role that allowed her to have maximum impact on institutional change. She had been promoted to Staff Sergeant and assigned as the Director of Culture Assessment and Reform, a newly created position that reported directly to the Secretary of Defense. Her mandate was simple but challenging: transform military culture to ensure that all personnel could serve with dignity and respect. The program she was announcing represented 2 years of research, pilot testing, and collaboration with experts from universities, advocacy organizations, and international military forces. It included innovative approaches to leadership training, peer intervention programs, and accountability systems that had shown remarkable success in test implementations. The Military Culture Reform Initiative is built on a simple premise, Sarah explained to the assembled reporters and military leaders. Every service member deserves to work in an environment where they are valued for their contributions, rather than judged by their gender, race, or other characteristics unrelated to their ability to serve. The statistics Sarah presented were encouraging. In the 2 years since Thompson's court-martial and the subsequent reforms, reports of harassment had decreased by 40% across the military. More importantly, satisfaction surveys showed that personnel now felt more confident that reports would be handled appropriately, and that retaliation against victims would not be tolerated. The program included several innovative components. Virtual reality training allowed personnel to experience harassment situations from multiple perspectives, helping them develop empathy and intervention skills. Anonymous reporting systems had been expanded and improved, making it easier for victims to seek help without fear of retaliation. Most significantly, leadership evaluation now included specific measures of unit climate and inclusion, making commanders directly accountable for creating positive environments. After the press conference, Sarah met privately with Secretary Williams, who had become a strong supporter of her work. The Secretary had been instrumental in securing funding and political support for the reform initiatives, and her backing had been crucial in overcoming resistance from more traditional military leaders. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Secretary Williams said, "Your work has exceeded even my highest expectations. The changes you've helped implement are already being studied by allied militaries around the world. You've not only improved our own force, but you've become a global leader in military reform." The international recognition was something Sarah had never anticipated. She had been invited to speak at military conferences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, sharing lessons learned from the American reform efforts. Other countries were implementing similar programs based on her recommendations, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the international military community. But for Sarah, the most meaningful measures of success came from individual stories of service members whose experiences had been improved by the reforms. She maintained regular contact with personnel who had benefited from the new policies, and their feedback helped guide continuing improvements to the programs. Private Santos, whose letter had meant so much to Sarah, had been promoted to sergeant and was now serving as a squad leader herself. She had implemented peer support programs in her unit that had become a model for other organizations. Her transformation from harassment victim to effective leader illustrated the potential that was unleashed when military personnel were allowed to focus on their missions rather than defending themselves from toxic colleagues. Sarah's original unit had been completely transformed under Colonel Stone's leadership. The toxic culture that had enabled Thompson's behavior had been replaced by an environment of mutual respect and professional excellence. The unit's performance had actually improved as personnel were able to focus on their mission rather than interpersonal conflicts and harassment. Lieutenant Colonel Burke, the commander whose failure to address harassment had contributed to Sarah's assault, had been reassigned to a training position where he worked to educate other leaders about the importance of addressing climate issues proactively. His experience had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignoring warning signs, but he had also become an advocate for the reforms that might have prevented his failure. Even Private Collins, the young soldier who had witnessed Thompson's assault, had grown into a leadership role. He had been promoted to sergeant and was now responsible for training new personnel on bystander intervention and reporting procedures. His experience of freezing during Sarah's assault had motivated him to ensure that other soldiers would be better prepared to intervene when they witnessed misconduct. Thompson himself had been released from military prison after serving his full sentence. His dishonorable discharge meant that he had lost all veteran benefits and faced significant challenges in finding civilian employment. Sarah occasionally wondered about his current situation, but she had decided not to track his post-military life. Her focus remained on preventing similar situations rather than dwelling on past injustices. As Sarah reflected on her journey from harassment victim to reform leader, she was struck by how much she had grown as both a soldier and a person. The assault that had once seemed like a career-ending trauma had instead become the catalyst for discovering her true calling. She had found purpose in helping others and creating positive change within an institution she loved. The work was far from finished. Despite significant progress, harassment and assault still occurred within military ranks, and Sarah knew that sustained effort would be required to maintain the positive momentum. Cultural change was a long-term process that required constant attention and reinforcement. Sarah's current assignment was scheduled to last another 3 years, during which she planned to expand the reform programs internationally and develop advanced training curricula for military academies. She was also pursuing a doctoral degree in organizational psychology, which would help her better understand the dynamics of institutional change. Looking toward the future, Sarah had begun considering what role she might play after her military career ended. Several universities had expressed interest in hiring her as a faculty member. Advocacy organizations had offered leadership positions, and corporate consulting firms wanted her expertise in organizational culture. But she was also intrigued by the possibility of running for political office, where she could influence policy at the national level. Whatever path she ultimately chose, Sarah knew that her experience had given her unique insights into leadership, courage, and the power of speaking truth to authority. The young soldier who had once questioned whether she belonged in special operations had become a recognized expert on military, culture, and organizational reform as she prepared for her next presentation to a gathering of international military leaders. Sarah thought about how different her life might have been if Thompson's assault had never occurred. She might have remained a competent but anonymous communications specialist, serving effectively but without the platform to create broader change. The irony was profound. Thompson had intended to destroy her career and drive her from military service. Instead, his assault had launched her into a position of influence and respect that allowed her to improve the lives of thousands of service members. His attempt to silence her had given her a voice that was now heard at the highest levels of government and military leadership. Sarah smiled as she reviewed her presentation notes. Tomorrow she would address military leaders from 15 countries about best practices in culture reform. The scared young soldier who had been kicked in the head 2 years ago had become a global advocate for positive change, proving that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become the foundation for our greatest achievements.